they get it. The other thing that I want you to know is we're working on R&D. We're working on information sharing regimes. And so there's this tightly knit idea of how do we align government, how do we align our own sector, how do we think about cross-sector involvement. There's nothing, if you think about Sandy and what the implications were there, there's nothing about electricity that doesn't touch finance and water and telecom and transportation. You've got to tie all that together. Finally, there's this notion of state and local governments. I think here in Washington, we get centered on federal responses to everything. You all know that the boots on the ground are the ones that see the problem and generally solve the problem. So we've got to tie together all the fusion centers and all the local responses to how these things go. One last thing, international makes this all complicated. There's this guy, Peter Zeihan, has written wonderful books about geopolitics and a variety of things. Latest book, y'all should read it, is The Accidental Superpower. The notion that because we have two oceans on our side and other kind of natural riches, we're kind of insulated. We know in this environment there's no such thing as a border that kind of protects you from cyber. And so the international element is something else that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful outline. And understanding that all of these different organizations on the local level, the federal level, are all talking to each other. Let's just back it up for just to one simple question.
Yep.
Would you say that the U.S. grid is safe?
Yes. Is the U.S. grid 100% insulated from threat? Absolutely not. But are we safe? Yeah. Let's talk about, let's go back to the Ukraine question. So it's been reported, for example, that Black Energy may have been involved in that. I can't say whether it was or wasn't. I'm just saying that was what was reported. We were informed, just to give you a case study of how we work, we were informed of the threat of Black Energy, which, you know, it's interesting. And for those of you that don't know, Black Energy really has nothing to do with energy. It has everything to do with, I call it a cyber Swiss Army knife. The big blade may be a doorway that allows bad guys to get in, but there's a whole lot of other functionality associated with Black Energy. So early in 2014, we got the word that this Black Energy thing was out there. And we started to take steps to protect ourselves against that. And there's very clear things you can do to protect yourself against Black Energy. But we all know there's a host of other things. And I was interested, I was listening to the panel before here, you know, naming the particular cyber threats is really kind of an impossible task, right? What you have to do is operate with principle and execute consistently.
And so, you know, the security researchers in the U.S. have pointed to a Russian hacking group as the source of the incident in Ukraine. And of course, there are a lot of geopolitics that are at play here. So would you say that you, as the CEO of a major company, are watching, you know, the news and the trends and the geopolitics and things as they play out in the U.S.? Because it seems like you were saying earlier that cyber does not necessarily just exist in a vacuum.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, I'll just tell you, we activate the ESCC. We have something called a playbook. And when something happens, the very first thing we do is make sure that our industry has what we call situational awareness. And I'll give you an example. Paris. When the attacks in Paris happened, we turned on the ESCC. We alerted everybody to this event. And if you recall, that was during the fall where there was a lot of public gatherings, football games, NBA season was just starting, a marathon in Las Vegas. And so we all started taking steps to go to a heightened level of security and particularly focused on where you may see crowds. We really do try to take a consistent effort to identify not only cyber threats, but physical threats in protecting the electric grid. I think we do a darn good job of it.
So on a more personal level, when you first hear about such a major attack on another country's grid, like in Ukraine, I mean, what is your first reaction, and what is the mood at your next office meeting?
So I chair, let's keep it at the ESCC level. So I chair the ESCC, and we have a wonderful industry group, the Edison Electric Institute. Tom Kuhn is the president of that. There's a guy that's the secretariat of the ESCC, works in EEI. His name is Scott Aronson. And a very typical response will be for me to call one of those two folks and just say, hey, are you aware of XYZ? I'll give you another one that started there and went nowhere. There was a blackout under Pepco's. They lost some power somewhere. And immediately I called a guy at Pepco and just said, hey, what's going on? And it turned out to be nothing. But in the event of Paris, we all said, yep, so let's get a note to the ESCC. We also worked with DHS, great folks there, Suzanne Spalding, Caitlin Durkovich, like I said, and DOE. We would alert Liz Sherwood-Randall and Ernie Moniz. So the first thing you do is situational awareness. If there are specific threat environment issues that seem to be arising, we make sure everybody knows that, and we all go to certain levels of security to protect ourselves. And so there's a sequence you follow.
And so, speaking of sequence, if something were to happen to the grid here, what are some of the steps that the sector needs to be taking on the local level to make sure that everything is up and running? And how much variation do you think that there is industry-wide in terms of how seriously organizations are taking cybersecurity threats?
Yeah, let me do the second question first, because that's, I think, most important. One of the other distinguishing characteristics of the electricity response to this threat is that we have moved to standardize as much as we can systems, technology, and information sharing regimes. We now have virtually, the vast majority of our customers in the United States covered under something called CRISP, which if anybody ever, I like to use sports analogies, but if anybody ever is a trout fisherman, or if you can imagine a trout fisherman, you ever watch the movie A River Runs Through It? But what do you look for when you fish for trout, right? The river is going by, and imagine the river is this immense amount of data that's going through all the servers in the industry and everything else. We have a wonderful structure called the EISAC that's analyzing kind of the amount of data moving through the servers via this CRISP technology. And what we're really looking for are anomalies, swirls. So when you trout fish, if you see a swirl in the water, that may be where you want to throw your line to catch something.
I'm getting the sense that you're a trout fisherman.
Actually, I'm not.
Okay.
But it's just a useful thing because I love the metaphor of this immense amount of water moving through a river, and then you're looking for something little. Through technology, what we look to do is identify perturbations or anomalies and then react to those and share those. I think it's an extraordinarily effective kind of technique, and there's a whole lot of others. So let me tell you something. I think sometimes we can criticize government, but when you look at the three-letter agencies and how they work together and how they try to share information at a federal level, they do a darn good job. And so what we try to do is leverage that capability in our own industry. The next steps will be for the ISAC to identify what it is, get information back out, and get ahead of these threats as they arise.
So speaking of information sharing, Congress passed a bill not so long ago encouraging the sharing of information from across the private sector, not just within one sector or another, with the government, and vice versa, from the government back to the private sector. So as that starts to get going, what do you think that the new era of corporate information sharing is going to look like? Yeah,
terrific question. See, let's look at the lifeline sectors. Okay, NIAC, National Infrastructure Advisory Council, has made a report to President Obama that deals with critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. They call out 5 sectors among these 16 that's been identified by DHS. Arguably the most, maybe I'm being parochial here, but the most important is electricity. I would go to finance right behind it. Maybe right behind that would be telecom, whatever that is, because that's a pretty broad thing, right? The next 4 and 5 might be water and transportation, whatever transportation is. And so we would say those 5 would create the lifeline sectors. Among those 5, in the United States, 87% of the critical infrastructure is owned by private companies. So it is imperative, in my view, and it's the recommendation of NIAC, to bring together these 5 companies, CEOs, these 5 sectors, as CEOs to represent those industries to make very timely, clear decisions about how to prepare for and respond to. Also to tie together at the ESCC level, the ISAC level, however we assimilate data and assess threats and then respond to do that at a priority basis. Third, that we use this group of people, CEOs, and I think CEOs are important here because these people can make decisions quickly, and to act as a pitcher, not a catcher. Back in sports, it's spring, pitchers and catchers. I want to tell the government and I want to inform Congress about the regulatory and legislative relief we need in order to better prepare and better respond to an attack. So these are the things that I want to use these lifeline sectors for. So when you say, well, here's a bill, let me tell you something. There's a few things in Congress today that I think we can get bipartisan support. One of those clearly is cyber protection. Now, some of that's pretty controversial, Apple versus the FBI, I get it. But in general, protecting the homeland, particularly for critical infrastructure, particularly in the lifeline sector group, is something people can get behind. One of the challenges Congress always faces, the administration faces, everything else, is understanding what's important and how we can better prepare for, respond to, by the private sector. I know there's a lot of smart people in Washington, but the private sector, I think, can inform that decision-making a heck of a lot and make us better.
So I do want to ask you about Israel, where hackers were able to use ransomware to infect a branch of the Israeli government that regulates the Israeli electricity market.
Yep.
And this brings up a question about the human factor of security. You know, no matter how critical the service or how aware of cybersecurity threats an organization might be, it seems like there's always an employee who might fall for a phishing scam. So what is a lesson that you could maybe draw from what happened there in terms of just cyber hygiene in this critical infrastructure sector?
Yeah, great stuff again. This is a wonderful question, and boy, sometimes I feel like Genghis Khan in responding to this one. But insider threats, one of the biggest deal you have to deal with. Now I will talk Southern.
Okay.
Southern Company. I'm actually from New Jersey, folks. We have an insider threat program. I don't want to give every detail about it, but it is similar to kind of two things that you're generally familiar with, I bet. One is FBI has a well-established process to evaluate insider threats. And so we use that kind of regime inside our company. The second thing is, in the nuclear industry, there is likewise a well-established behavioral-based approach to identifying potential issues. And so we bring those together. We have a terrific, I think, insider threat program. So that was kind of, what was the other one? Anyway, insider threat program is a big deal. And certainly there's different ways to evaluate it, but clearly there are, phishing, that was the one you said.
Yeah, the cyber hygiene question.
We attack ourselves all the time. I'm a former CIO, right? You all know what CIO stands for, right? Most days I thought that stood for career is over. But I think in my industry, I'm the only CIO that rose to be a CEO. Interestingly now, in our own succession planning at Southern Company, we view these kinds of experiences, IT experience, this kind of thing, as being critical to leading a large, complex organization. You know, it used to be legal and finance and marketing, but markets are changing because of technology, threats and opportunities are changing.